Greetings from Toronto, Canada and Geneva, Switzerland. My name is Simon Chambers, Director of Communications for the ACT Alliance, and I'm joined by Mariana Aderston from the World Council of Churches to moderate this press briefing. Today, we will be interviewing three of our colleagues who just returned from visiting Hungary, Ukraine, and Romania, where they met with church leaders and humanitarian actors responding to the desperate needs of thousands of people fleeing the war in Ukraine. ACT Alliance and WCC members have been supporting and working with people impacted by the conflict in Ukraine for years and have only redoubled their efforts when the crisis escalated late last month. Mariana, I'd like to invite you to introduce our panel.
Thank you very much, Simon. It's an honor to present our panel from ACT Alliance, Rudolmar Bueno de Faria, General Secretary, and from the World Council of Churches, we have Professor Dr. Isabel Apao-Piri, the Deputy General Secretary for Public Witness and Diaconia, and Peter Prove, Director of International Affairs. Warm welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you for joining us today. I'd like to begin, Rudolmar, by asking you if you can tell us what the current situation is in Ukraine and the surrounding countries. What did you see on your visit?
Yeah, in our visit to Ukraine and neighboring countries, specifically Hungary and Romania, you have seen the consequences of a war which is forcing thousands of people to leave their land and keep millions trapped by the conflict and the consequences that this conflict poses on human lives and human beings. On the other hand, we have seen also the solidarity of local communities, churches, humanitarian organizations, and also governments from the neighboring countries to provide all kinds of assistance to those people in need. And that was varying from food, shelter, protection, legal assistance to the refugees seeking for asylum, for instance, to psychosocial and spiritual support. And we have seen also a strong cooperation between civil society organizations, together also with local and government authorities that are in charge of supporting refugees and internally displaced people in these countries. And the people fleeing the war receive support during different points of their journey. And churches and church-related organizations were absolutely, without any doubt, the major provider of this support. In all the points of the borders, we saw faith-based organizations, churches providing the support that the people has needed, even not seeing some of the traditional players like the UN. And but what we saw as well as in any war, the risks of for human trafficking and forced labor. The big majority of the people that are on the move due to this war are women and children. As men between 18 and 16 years old, they were not allowed to leave Ukraine. And this, of course, poses a need for humanitarian organizations to have a gendered approach in our response. And we also saw the inequalities existing within our societies, and including in war situations. We heard from ACT members, from church workers, and also local authorities that the first wave of refugees were mainly of people with healthy financial situations and good connections in Europe. The second wave brought those that are not necessarily financially advantaged. And the third one that we are facing now is of people without any resources and much more dependent of humanitarian support and protection. And during the visit, we could see the distinctive role churches and faith-based organizations played in the emergency response so far. ACT members and churches have responded from day 2 of the war, using their structures to provide shelter, food, protection, psychosocial and spiritual support, especially for those that are traumatized by the war. That is what we did see during our visit.
Thank you very much, Rudolmar. That's very helpful to hear both the positive and the negative. And we know that the impact on the most vulnerable will only continue to grow in the coming days, as you pointed out about that third wave. Isabel, could you talk to us, please, about what you saw, the witness of the churches among those very first responders to the crisis?
Yeah, both in Hungary and in Romania, we heard, the churches, telling us that they were among the first ones to respond to the crisis at the borders. And for me, I think it's not so much them responding to this particular issue. It's because they already have structures in the churches to respond to any humanitarian need. So whatever structures that they have used in the past to respond to refugees, from other countries, as well as, during the COVID crisis, they used the same structures now to respond to the humanitarian needs of the refugees, coming out of Ukraine. So it's that ongoing ministry of the churches, which is there before the limelight comes, to the troubled places, and it remains there even when the limelight has shifted to other crises in the world. The churches still remain on the ground to assist those who need their help.
Thank you, Isabel. I think it's very important to note the presence of churches before, during, and after conflicts. I think that's one of the real strengths that churches bring into these situations. Peter, can you give us a bit of your sense, your analysis of the situation and what you saw and heard on this visit?
Well, I think the first point to emphasize, in addition to affirming the remarks made by my fellow travelers, Rudolmar and Isabel, is the dimensions of this humanitarian catastrophe. I think the latest figures that we've heard from UN sources indicate that something approaching 10 million people are displaced as a result of this conflict. Both the refugees that have crossed borders to other countries and those who are internally displaced within Ukraine. That is 1/4 of the entire population of the country. So that really sets the dimensions of this crisis in perspective. I think I also want to underline the incredible engagement of the churches and church-related organizations locally and nationally in the countries that are receiving refugees, certainly as we observed it in Hungary and Romania. I mean, this welcome, organized at the local level by local communities and local churches, is incredibly warm, is incredibly hospitable, and that is very much to be celebrated. I only wish that all refugees from whichever country, from whichever ethnic and racial identity, and from whichever religious identity they come, could also receive such a warm and hospitable welcome.
Thank you, Peter. It's really great to hear the local aspect of this response as well, that it's not just the international actors, it's not just at the level of top leadership, but it really is the local churches, the local people who are responding to need in that compassionate way that Christ calls us to in our own ministry. Mariana, over to you.
Thank you very much, Simon. I would like to turn back to Rudolmar. You are the General Secretary of ACT Alliance, and you have been traveling in the region for almost a week. What are the main contributions ACT members and churches are providing when it comes to the refugees and the internally displaced people? What are the needs they are reporting to you, and what have you seen?
Yeah, thank you, Marianne, for this question. Well, ACT members and churches are providing a wide range of support to internally displaced people, to refugees, but also to host communities. And the main support actions that we saw and that were related by the members are related to food delivery, shelter, transportation, legal assistance, and protection. That's one of the big issues there as well. And the churches, specifically the churches, are providing something that was very special for the refugees. That was the psychosocial and also the spiritual support to the people on the move. And the ACT members that are already responding in this situation is the Hungarian Interchurch Aid, working in Ukraine and Hungary. We have a HEX and ADROM working in Romania and in the border with Moldova, because a lot of people are traveling to this country as well. And the Lutheran World Federation in Poland and Slovakia, but we have not visited these two countries. Our Hungarian member has been working in Ukraine for more than 25 years and have all the necessary structure in place. Now, of course, adapted to the humanitarian situation to provide support to the internal displaced people and host communities in Ukraine as well. And in Hungary, we, for example, Ukrainians that were out of the country when the war started, and that are flying via Budapest to go back home. The ACT member in Hungary has established a welcome center at the airport in Budapest, providing food, resting rooms or areas, and also space for children to play. And they provide also information on the existing alternatives they have to travel back to their home or look for shelters in Hungary or neighboring countries. And those who do not have where to go, they are also offering a refugee center where people can stay the time they need until the next move. And in our visit, we also have witnessed the operations led by the ACT Alliance members and churches from different denominations. That was also very important and in a coordinated way. And we have seen the work of the at the borders between Ukraine and Hungary, Romania and Ukraine, and also in Romania and Moldova. And in each border, the situation have common patterns, of course, but also some differences depending on the region the people are fleeing from. And some of them have problems with languages. So the ACT members in Romania, for instance, they have engaged bilingual staff to support the refugees. So we also saw how proud our members and churches were when welcoming refugees that were not Ukrainians. In Romania, hundreds of Indian students in Ukraine were received by the local authorities and the churches, and they have provided specialized care for them. We spoke with the people from the churches that have been cooking meals for them. They indicated how, and also showed pictures to us of food with curry that is not typical from the region, but they were providing to the refugees. That is one of the spices in the Indian food. But as Peter mentioned, unfortunately, we also heard about situations of discriminations against refugees from other nationalities within Ukraine and in some of the neighboring countries as well. And the distinctive treatment for non-European refugees was part of the debate we had with our members, but also with the church leaders that have condemned this practice.
Thank you, Rudolmar. May I ask you also a little bit, for those who are not very familiar with the ACT Alliance, how are you working with your partners? You are coordinating somehow from the Geneva office, but please explain it a bit more so we understand the reality with all those members, churches working together side by side, because you're not only focusing on Ukraine, you are also elsewhere in the world at the moment.
Exactly. Thank you very much. That's very important. The ACT Alliance, that stands for Action by Churches Together, is a coalition of churches, Protestant and Orthodox, providing humanitarian development and advocacy work throughout the world. And that is done in a cooperative way. The support, the actions happening now in the regions are supported by all ACT members that bring funding, but also expertise. We have seen in the region also seconded staff providing support to the ACT members, but also to the churches for them to scale up their operations. So ACT Alliance is present in all continents, in 125 plus countries. and all of them are providing some kind of, from solidarity messages to practical support as well.
Thank you very much. Let's turn back to Isabel. You are the Deputy General Secretary for the World Council of Churches, representing 352 member churches in 120 countries, and you have been serving almost 10 years in the WCC, and you have paid visit to many of the member churches across the globe. What have you seen in terms of people's offering a helping hand when you were visiting the region last week? And is it possible for you to lift up some of the human dignities aspects from your visit?
Yeah, the first one is just to add to what Ruduma had said earlier on about many people coming to help, right? When we visited the Hungarian Interchurch Aid, we met some people, coming from the Dan Church Aid and the Thin Church Aid. And we were told that, there will be others, coming from the Bread for the World, coming to help. So they are not just sending money, but they are also sending personnel, to go to Lviv in Ukraine to assist as much as they possibly can. And I'm told that, these are not the only specialized ministries that have sent some kind of help, towards the borderline. But there are many more sending help, to assist. But then at a local level, what we heard was that there was a call made to the members of the churches, to say, is there anybody willing to accept refugees in their homes? And we hear that, many more people registered, to take in refugees in their homes. And it makes a huge difference, when you welcome somebody in your home as opposed to welcoming somebody in a refugee center, right? So there you see the humanization of the people, who have been affected, by the war. And the other thing that I also noticed is that as refugees entered into, be it Hungary or Romania, one would observe, some rituals, that some of them were performing. I saw a particular woman, young woman, that touched my heart. The moment she crossed over to, I think it must have been in Romania, but I've forgotten exactly where. But she knelt down and she prayed, to thank God for having crossed over to safety. And then she was making a phone call, to let her people know that, she's gone through. And then once they are welcomed, in one of the areas, I think this was in Romania, there was a center where people could go and have food, but it was, for the Jews, to respect their religion, to make sure that, there's kosher food that is available to them. And there was another one which we saw next to it, which was for the Muslims. They are also being welcomed in that way. And this is Lent time. And the Orthodox were also offering food that is appropriate for the Orthodox. And for me, all those are signs of, humanizing them, to say that, despite the dislocation that you have gone through, these are parts of us saying that, you are welcome, and we recognize the trauma that you have gone through, and we recognize also the face of God in you as an individual. So I was really pleased, to hear about this warmth that is coming from the spirit to another spirit, and welcoming them to be part of the countries where they've gone to. But then I also want to comment on what Ruduma and Peter had also touched on the issue of welcoming foreigners, okay, who are also coming from Ukraine into these, countries. it wasn't an automatic issue that, the churches opened up, their arms to embrace them. Giving the example of the Indian students who had come, the fathers didn't know that they were going to get Indian students. They were expecting the Ukrainian students. So they said it themselves that we were surprised that, we had been sent Indian students when we were expecting Ukrainians. And it's easier for them to deal with Ukrainians because they are part of them. But to deal with another race, it wasn't a straightforward thing. But because they were put in that situation, I appreciate what one father said. He said, they had to accept them. And in the process, they themselves were transformed, and thereafter, it was easier for them to welcome the foreigners, to be among them.
Thank you very much, Isabel, for also bringing very positive signs of hope in the midst of the darkness we are facing at the moment, and also very concrete example how we also are able to transform others and ourselves in the midst of everything. Thank you for that. I would like to turn to Peter. You have also a legal background, and we would like to ask you about the legal perspective. How would you describe the challenges ahead from a perspective of international law and in the view of also possible war crimes, etc.? What can the global fellowship, the international community, do to support in this context? Working with and through churches and related agencies. I know that you are also very well connected to the UN system. Please bring us into the light in this area.
Thank you, Marianne. Yes, I think it's fairly obvious to everybody that the attacks that appear to be targeting civilians and civilian infrastructure are likely to constitute war crimes and crimes against humanity. And I know that a great deal of attention is already being paid to this issue, and that investigations are already underway. The International Criminal Court is seized of the issue and undertaking investigations with regard to possible individual accountability for war crimes and crimes against humanity. And I think that this is correct, that such investigations should be launched, and where possible and where appropriate, prosecutions undertaken. And I am reasonably confident that that will happen in due course. So I think that the important principle here is one of accountability. For those who undertake such actions, who commit such crimes, they must be held accountable, and they must know that they are at risk of being held accountable if they undertake such things. Once again, I think the larger picture, though, is of consistency and of equity and of equal justice, so that such crimes are prosecuted to the extent possible in every case, not just in this case. And there, I think we still have a long way to go in order to ensure that equality of treatment and to ensure that the same standard applies to all situations, so as to provide a disincentive to those who might otherwise perpetrate such crimes. But I hope that the experience and the outcome and the subsequent follow-up on these sorts of matters in Ukraine can already provide some sort of check and balance against future crimes of this type. I also think what's really important for the international community, and also for us in the ecumenical movement, is to make sure that in the midst of so much confrontation and so many efforts to isolate, that we also maintain channels of dialogue and diplomacy. And I think it's incumbent upon us within the ecumenical movement to be a space, a safe space for dialogue and exchange, even if some of the perspectives and sentiments may be fundamentally difficult to tolerate on the other side. But we must provide a safe space for that exchange. Otherwise, we are simply complicit in another maybe generation-long period of separation and division.
Thank you, Peter. One follow-up question. How are you working with member churches when it's coming to this kind of crisis? Are you in touch with them? How do you relate also to the members in the commission with expertise in this field? Maybe comment in a brief for those who are listening don't know how we are operating in the World Council of Churches.
Of course, the dialogue that we undertake with counterparts on the different sides of this conflict is very delicate and not in the public domain. There is a saying that you can either make news or make peace, but you can't do both at the same time. But we are trying to use the platform of the World Council of Churches as a platform for dialogue among the member churches that find themselves on both sides of this conflict in order to share perspectives and to hopefully reach at least a minimum consensus about the nature of the current situation and how the churches might play a role in alleviating and hopefully ending it. But we are in close contact with member churches on both sides of the conflict and in the immediate region. And we hope to expand those circles of dialogue over time in order to bring a larger ecumenical body, a larger ecumenical fellowship to bear on this huge, huge challenge.
Thank you, Peter. Back to you, Simon.
Thank you very much, Mariana. Rudolmar, I'd like to come back to you and talk a little bit about the way ACT Alliance works through the local churches and church-based agencies, because all of you have mentioned the responses of the local churches, the local clergy, the local humanitarian actors. And I'm hoping you can tell us a little bit about the importance of localization within ACT Alliance's global humanitarian work, and also the particular role of ecumenical diaconia within that, the service of the churches to the world.
Yeah, that are two important things. Localization means to promote local leadership and also decision-making and also actions on the ground, because we know that those based in the communities, they are better placed to play a first responding kind of action when situations like this happen. And also the issue of the ecumenical diaconia, because for ACT Alliance, we are action by churches together. We have to promote and to live our faith and our identity. So that is our two important things for us. So ACT Alliance has been over the years strengthening our commitment, but also practical actions to promote localization. That means to engage with local leaders, local organizations, local churches to be playing the major role in humanitarian and development situations. And specifically in Ukraine, but also in the neighboring countries, we realize that most of the population is Christians. And the churches and its specialized ministries have been established there with structures for centuries to provide diaconal support for the people in need, to hospitals, clinics, whatever it is necessary, but shelter as well for people on the move. And they have been supporting development work, providing support to refugees fleeing from conflicts from the Middle East and Europe in the past. More recently, before this crisis, the Second World War, they were part of providing support as well. And many of them are very closely connected with the communities and have the capacity to mobilize a huge number of volunteers for their diaconal work. And that's not many organizations can do that. Even governments, they don't have this capacity or this call, this authority to do this. And the church leaders, as you know, in every place, have a strong influence on the life of people. And they can count on their constituencies, their communities, to mobilize them to have a community-led response to the crisis. And these social structures are available in most of the places we have visited, in Hungary, Romania, and Ukraine. And there is a structure that not many organizations, as I said, have. And we need to take advantage of that. But one thing that the only churches and faith-based organizations can do is to provide care and attention to the people in need from a spiritual perspective. We know that in times of crisis, faith and religion played an important role in the lives of people to overcome their trauma, to trigger solidarity, as we saw in many of the communities and places we have visited, and also to engage people in action and compassionate responses. That is what ACT Alliance believes.
Thank you very much, Rudelmar. That's very important and helpful to hear about the way that ACT Alliance does its work, and will continue to do its work as it moves forward through this crisis. Isabel, I'd like to turn to you and ask you if you can expand a little bit from the World Council of Churches perspective on some of the things that Rudelmar was just talking about, because he talked about the presence of churches within these communities for centuries, and also the unique role that churches play in responding to the spiritual and psychosocial needs of those who are being impacted by the war. I'm wondering if you can tell us what you're seeing happening already, or what the challenges are that you see in terms of offering spiritual and psychosocial support for refugees by the churches in Ukraine, Hungary, Romania, and the other countries.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Simon. Yes, it's true that the church has to play a prominent role in making sure that the refugees are taken care of spiritually. But we know that as much as the refugees say that they need spiritual help, maybe that's the first thing that comes to their mind, that please pray for me. And then thereafter, then they would talk about, they need warm food, they need accommodation, they need, transport money to go to wherever they want to go, to seek help. But we also realize that, in the longer term, the biggest role for the churches would be trauma healing. We've seen that in South Africa, we've seen it in Rwanda, we've seen it in Northern Ireland and in Colombia, that the damage caused by war lasts for decades. If left untreated, it continues, from one generation to another. So the trauma healing is something that the churches can provide, to the refugees, and just to make sure that people are able to forgive each other despite the tremendous pain that they instill in each other. That there is a possibility to forgive despite what you have gone through. And that's the gift that the church will bring, in this particular case as well. The ability to discuss, the ability to forgive for your own healing, so that you can move on. And also that, the next generations after you do not perpetuate the same crimes.
Thank you. That's very, very helpful to hear, and particularly thinking about that in a multi-generational sense. I think that we do need to be aware that the actions that happen today do have impacts that, as you say, last for decades on those who are affected. And it's really good to know that the churches are there and responding to those needs over that long period of time, as well as the immediate life-saving needs of today. Peter, I'd like to turn to you now and ask, what are the aspects of the crisis where you see churches as uniquely placed to respond to the needs? And what are the strengths that we bring to this response in your perspective?
So I would very much affirm what Isabella has just said about the psychosocial role of churches in terms of healing trauma and preventing intergenerational transmission of the experiences and the emotions and the suffering that has been incurred in this context, and to prevent that from occurring again, hopefully, God willing. But in addition to that, I would also like to add the very practical operational fact that I think and there are many others who share this view, that this might be a context in which it becomes actually very difficult for Western-based agencies, church-based or otherwise, to operate. And so that really brings into focus the critical operational necessity of working with and through the churches in their own contexts, in Ukraine, also in Russia, and certainly in the countries on the Western side receiving refugees, to be stronger and more effective and more capable actors in responding to a crisis of these dimensions. And we've already seen that they have significant resources and capacities already, but they will need more because this crisis is far from over. And if the conflict continues, we can expect more and potentially even larger refugee outflows and more displacement. So more capacity will be needed, but I think that it will be a strategic and operational necessity to work especially with and through the churches themselves in their own contexts.
I think you've underscored a very important point there, Peter, around the need to work through the local organizations and the local people who understand that context and the way to engage in their context, and particularly the role that churches play in that, because as we've already said, they've been around for so long in these contexts. I also think it's important to note the potential growth of scale. You talked earlier about 1/4 of Ukrainians already displaced, and it's just frightening to think about how much worse that could get if this conflict continues. So thank you for those sobering but very important thoughts. Mariana, I'll turn it over to you now.
Thank you very much to the entire panel for taking the time to share the insight with us and also describe the work on the ground. The final question to all of you: what is coming up the next coming days and weeks from your perspective within the ACT Alliance and the World Council of Churches? And I turn the word first of all to you, Rudelmar. What's on the agenda for ACT Alliance at this moment? Maybe you could take it both from the global perspective, but also from the partners' perspective.
Yeah, thank you, Marianne. Yeah, work, work, work. That's what we are expecting in the coming days and weeks, because we know that the conflict is not over. It's just increasing, amounting, the volume of conflicts and also the displacement of people. And now are those that are much more in need that are crossing the border. So we need to be prepared for that. And for that reason, ACT Alliance has launched $21.5 million appeal, focusing on responding to in 5 countries, Ukraine, Hungary, Poland, Romania, and Slovakia, to support people displaced by the war in Ukraine. And we are also and will continue supporting our members to scale up the responses. We saw that in Romania. The aid room is providing already support with the resources they had, but now they will be part of this appeal that we will be reviewed. So they will have much more capacity to respond to the third wave of refugees that is coming now. As I mentioned, where the most vulnerable people will be crossing the borders and also looking for refuge and asylum in some of the countries. And our members are also equipping or working on behalf of the small churches in some of the countries receiving refugees. And as Peter mentioned, in terms of the role of the Western organizations, that is valid for ACT Alliance as well. And that is a role that we need to play to strengthen the capacity of our member churches or the churches related to the ACT Alliance and to the World Council of Churches and the Lutheran World Federation, for us to be able to provide, to increase their capacity as well. And that's part of the localization agenda, as I mentioned before. And we will be engaging as well in many other humanitarian, together with other humanitarian organizations, in coordination and to coordinate our responses and advocate for the end of the war. Because the humanitarian advocacy is crucial in this case, and the respect to the international humanitarian law, international law, is critical, as Peter has mentioned. And the ACT Alliance will also engage with its members churches and civil society organizations to discern on the political dimension of this war, including the proliferation of misinformation and the potential breaches of the international humanitarian law in this war. And that may be occurring in both sides, and that's something that we need to have also in mind. And we know that the humanitarian response to refugees in this war is quite different from those wars and conflicts in other continents. We saw that by ourselves, and the structures to support refugees and the level of support from the communities, the neighboring countries and the international communities are much higher comparing with those in Africa, Asia, Latin America. Therefore, we need to advocate to ensure that all humanitarian response are considered with the necessary financial support, but also political commitment from the international community to promote peace and sustainable solutions for the people affected by the war. That will be our major engagement in the next days and weeks, hopefully not months. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rudolmar, and all the best for the hard work waiting for ACT and all the partners. I would like to turn to you, Isabel. The role of the World Council of Churches is a bit different, but what's on your agenda for the next coming days and weeks? And is it also possible for you to mention the connection between ACT Alliance and World Council of Churches, how we are also coordinating the work for those who are not familiar with how we are operating?
Okay, good. Thank you so much, Marianne. I'm an employee of the World Council of Churches, but I serve as a member of the board of ACT Alliance to make sure that we strengthen that link that is there between ACT Alliance and the WCC. So whilst we were visiting, Hungary and Romania, we also talked about what about the Ukrainian refugees on the other side, those that are going to Russia and those that are going to Belarus, right? So we would like to explore that possibility of, visiting those refugees as well, so that we can see for ourselves how those refugees are being helped. Is it the same with what we saw on this in Romania and in Hungary, or is it different? And how can we mobilize the churches to help the refugees that have gone to Russia and to Belarus, knowing that this is a very difficult area, but still, as churches, we need to pay attention to that as well. And the second one is, we were told again and again that, among the refugees, 30% are coming out, 70%, they are still inside. There are a lot of internally displaced people. So this is where we need to advocate for corridors, for humanitarian aid to reach those who are still inside and need our help.
Thank you, Isabel. Then I will turn finally to you, Peter. And you're also serving for the World Council of Churches, but you have also the responsibility for international affairs. What's on the agenda from your point of view? And it's also possible for you to describe a little bit the connection to the UN system from your position.
So in addition to the advocacy for respect for international humanitarian law, for the promotion of safe and secure humanitarian corridors, which will certainly be part of our advocacy. But we will also have a very big focus in the coming days and weeks on maintaining the channels of communication and dialogue with our member churches and between our member churches on both sides of this conflict. And we will be hoping to use the World Council of Churches as a safe space, as a platform where we can have that dialogue, a frank exchange about the nature of this situation, how we got here, and most importantly, how we can exit from it and the role of the churches in that regard. That is a key priority for us in the next days and weeks.
Thank you, Peter. Over to Simon.
Thank you very much, Rudolmar, Isabel, and Peter, for the insights and the reflections and witness that you brought today for helping us to understand what's going on the ground in these countries. It's been a sobering and powerful discussion. I'd also like to thank those of you from the media who joined in watching this briefing. If you would like to contact ACT Alliance or the World Council of Churches to arrange an interview with any of our speakers, you can reach out to me at simon.chambers@actalliance.org or to the WCC's media team at media@wcc-coe.org. You can find more stories and information about our work around the world, and in particular in responding to this crisis, on our websites at actalliance.org or ecumene.org. Thank you again for joining us, and we look forward to speaking with you more in the future.